She was just the new maid at the mansion, but when the millionaire saw her dancing alone in the garden, he fell hopelessly in love. The shrill sound of the alarm clock echoed through Madison Ramirez's small bedroom, abruptly rousing her from her sleep. With a groan, she reached out to silence the device, her fingers groping blindly on the bedside table. As she struggled to open her eyes, the reality of her new job hit her like a bucket of cold water. Today was her first day as a maid at the Ashworth Mansion, one of the most imposing residences in Newport, Rhode Island. Madison stood up, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement run through her body. At 25, she had never imagined she would be in this situation. Just 6 months ago, she was about to graduate with a degree in dance from Juilliard, with a promising future ahead of her. But life has its own plans, and a knee injury during her graduation recital had shattered her dreams of a professional career on stage. Now here she was, about to start a job for which she had no experience whatsoever, in a city where she knew no one. But Madison wasn't the type to give up easily. If she couldn't dance professionally, she would find another way to survive and perhaps reinvent her dreams. As she got ready, Madison couldn't help thinking about how her life had changed so drastically. The simple, practical uniform she now wore was a constant reminder of her new reality. She tied her long brown hair up in an austere bun and looked at herself in the mirror. Her green eyes, inherited from her Mexican grandmother, shone with determination. "You can do it, Madison," she muttered to herself, adjusting the collar of her blouse. "It's just a job, you've faced worse." With one last look at the rented room she now called home, Madison picked up her bag and left. The fresh Newport morning air welcomed her, laden with the smell of the sea. She inhaled deeply, letting the salty breeze calm her nerves. The road to the Ashworth Mansion was a journey through Newport's most exclusive neighborhoods. Madison watched the huge houses and impeccable gardens, feeling smaller and smaller. Finally, she arrived at the imposing gates of the Ashworth estate. A security guard greeted her with a brusque nod, checking her name off a list before allowing her to enter. Madison walked down the long avenue, her footsteps echoing on the impeccably laid gravel. The mansion grew before her, an imposing structure of stone and glass that seemed to defy gravity itself. At the back door, Madison was greeted by a middle-aged woman with a stern countenance. "Miss Ramirez, I presume," she said, her tone cold and formal. "I'm Mrs. Hartley, head housekeeper. Follow me, I'll show you your duties." The next few hours passed in a blur of instructions, rules, and introductions. Madison struggled to absorb every detail, determined not to make any mistakes. The mansion was a maze of luxurious corridors, sumptuous rooms, and a multitude of expensive objects that she dreaded touching. While cleaning one of the numerous living rooms, Madison couldn't help but notice the photographs scattered across the tables and walls. They showed a distinguished-looking man in his 30s, with dark hair and piercing eyes. In some pictures, he was surrounded by celebrities and politicians. In others, he seemed to be in exotic locations around the world. "That's Mr. Ashworth," said a voice behind her, making her jump. It was Mia, another waitress she had met earlier. "Alexander Ashworth, the owner of all this." Madison nodded, quickly returning to her work. "Is he always traveling?" Mia shrugged. "Most of the time, but I hear he's due back this week. Mrs. Hartley is driving everyone crazy with the preparations." Mia's words made Madison feel a pang of anxiety. The thought of meeting the mysterious Mr. Ashworth made her nervous. She shook her head, trying to dispel these thoughts. After all, it was unlikely that the owner of the mansion would even notice her. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of tasks. When she finally finished her shift, Madison was exhausted, but pleased to have survived the first day. As she walked back to her rented room, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. This was not the future she had imagined for herself. That night, unable to sleep, Madison went out for a walk. Her feet took her to a small deserted beach, not far from her apartment. The full moon bathed the sand in a silvery light, and the waves broke gently on the shore. Without a second thought, Madison took off her shoes and began to dance. Her movements were fluid and graceful, a mixture of classical ballet and contemporary dance. There, under the starry sky, with only the sea as a witness, she allowed herself to be free again. As she danced, Madison let all the pent-up emotions flow through her. The frustration of the injury that had ended her career, the fear of the uncertain future, the loneliness of being in a strange city. All of this she channeled into her dancing. Lost in her own world, Madison didn't notice the car that drove slowly along the road near the beach. She didn't see the driver slow down, mesmerized by the sight of the young woman dancing in the moonlight. Alexander Ashworth was returning from a long business trip, anxious to get home and rest. But the sight of the mysterious dancer on the beach left him completely fascinated. He stopped the car, unable to look away. There was something about the way she moved that touched him deeply. The gracefulness of her movements, the pure emotion that emanated from every gesture. It was as if she was telling a story without words, a story of pain, hope, and resistance. For several minutes, Alexander stood there, watching in silence. Part of him wanted to get closer, to talk to her, to find out who this extraordinary woman was. But another part, the part that had learned to distrust people and their intentions, stopped him. Finally, with one last look at the lonely dancer, Alexander started the engine and went on his way. But her image remained etched in his mind, a moment of beauty and vulnerability that he knew he would never forget. Madison, oblivious to the fact that she was being watched, continued her dance until she felt her muscles protest. When she finally stopped, panting and sweating, she felt lighter than she had in months. Dancing had always been her way of processing emotions, of connecting with herself. As she walked home, Madison made a promise to herself. No matter what the future held, she would find a way to keep dance in her life. Perhaps not on the big stages as she had dreamed, but somehow, somewhere she would dance. What Madison didn't know was that her fate had already been irrevocably altered that night. The man who had watched her dance was not only her new employer, but someone who would be instrumental in her journey of self-discovery and healing. The next morning, when Madison arrived at Ashworth Manor for her second day of work, there was a different atmosphere in the air. The staff were whispering amongst themselves, casting anxious glances towards the main wing of the house. "Mr. Ashworth came back last night," Mia whispered to Madison as they polished the silverware in the kitchen. "Mrs. Hartley is a nervous wreck. Apparently, he's asked to see all the new stuff this afternoon." Madison felt a knot forming in her stomach. The thought of being introduced to Mr. Ashworth made her inexplicably nervous. She tried to convince herself that it was just the natural apprehension of meeting her new boss. But there was something else, a strange feeling she couldn't explain. The day passed in a blur of frantic activity, with all the staff working hard to ensure that every detail of the mansion was perfect. When the afternoon arrived, Madison joined the other new employees in the Great Hall, and then he walked in. Alexander Ashworth was even more impressive in person than in the photographs. Tall and well-dressed, he exuded an aura of confidence and power. But it was his eyes that captured Madison's attention, deep, intense, and, surprisingly, charged with a sadness she hadn't expected to see. When Alexander's eyes met hers, Madison felt as if the world had stopped. There was a glimmer of recognition in his gaze, a spark of something she couldn't name. For a moment, it was as if only the two of them existed in that huge room, and so, without either of them realizing it, the stage was set for a story that would change their lives forever. A story of secrets, redemption, and a love that would defy all expectations. The brief encounter with Alexander Ashworth left Madison in a state of confusion. There was something in that look, in that moment of connection, that disturbed her in a way she couldn't explain. In the days that followed, she found herself thinking about him more often than she would like to admit. The routine at the Ashworth mansion quickly became more hectic with the owner's presence. Madison noticed a subtle change in the behavior of all the staff. There was a tension in the air, an almost palpable need to impress the boss. One morning, while Madison was cleaning one of the living rooms, she heard voices coming from the adjoining office. The door was ajar, and she couldn't help overhearing the heated conversation between Alexander and a man she didn't recognize. "Alex, you can't go on like this," said the unknown voice, with a tone of concern. "It's been 3 years. You need to move on." "It's not that simple, Marcus," Alexander replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "You don't understand. The guilt, it consumes me every day." Madison knew she shouldn't be listening, but something in Alexander's voice stopped her from turning away. There was a pain so deep in his words that she felt her heart squeeze. "The accident wasn't your fault, Alex," Marcus insisted. "Sophia wouldn't want you to live like this, punishing yourself forever." The sound of something being thrown against the wall made Madison jump. "Don't talk about her like you know her better than I do," Alexander shouted, his voice breaking. "She was my wife, Marcus, my responsibility, and I let her down." Madison stepped back, shocked by the intensity of emotion in Alexander's voice. She had never imagined that the powerful, controlled man she had only met a few days ago could carry so much pain. At that moment, the office door opened fully, and Alexander stepped out, his face a mask of anguish. He stopped abruptly at the sight of Madison, his eyes widening in recognition and then narrowing in suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and cutting. Madison felt her face burn with shame. I was just cleaning up, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Get out," Alexander ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Now, without hesitation, Madison dropped the cleaning cloth and practically ran out of the room, her heart beating furiously in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the kitchen, where she leaned on the sink, trying to catch her breath. "Are you all right, dear?" asked Mrs. Peterson, the elderly cook, looking at Madison with concern. Madison nodded, unable to speak. Her mind was spinning with what she had just heard and witnessed. Alexander Ashworth, the powerful and seemingly unshakable millionaire, carried deep pain and overwhelming guilt, and now she had inadvertently become a witness to his vulnerability. In the days that followed, Madison did her best to avoid crossing Alexander's path. She concentrated on her chores, keeping her head down and avoiding the areas of the house where she knew he was usually to be found. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the image of Alexander with his face contorted in pain out of her head. One night, unable to sleep, Madison decided to go for a walk in the gardens of the mansion. It was late, and she knew she shouldn't be there. But the need for fresh air and space to think overcame her common sense. As she walked among the carefully tended rose beds, Madison heard a soft sound coming from a small greenhouse at the bottom of the garden. Curious, she quietly approached. Through the fogged glass, she saw a solitary figure sitting on a stone bench. It was Alexander, and he was crying. His shoulders were shaking with silent sobs, and in his hands he held what looked like a photograph. Madison's heart broke at the sight of the scene. The whole image of the powerful, untouchable man shattered, revealing someone deeply human and broken. Without thinking, she took a step forward, stepping on a dry branch. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, and Alexander's head lifted abruptly. For a moment, the two of them stood frozen, staring at each other through the glass of the greenhouse. Then Alexander stood up, his face a mixture of anger and shame. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Madison stammered, looking for an explanation. I couldn't sleep. I came for a walk." "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone would be here." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, as if deciding what to do. Finally, he let out a tired sigh. "Come in," he said, surprising Madison. "Since you're here, we can talk." Hesitating, Madison entered the greenhouse. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers and humidity. Alexander sat back down on the bench, and after a moment's hesitation, Madison joined him. "You must be wondering what you heard the other day," Alexander finally said, his voice low and controlled. Madison nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to pry, sir. It was an accident." Alexander gave a humorless laugh. "Accidents seem to haunt me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Then, to Madison's surprise, he began to speak. "My wife, Sophia, died 3 years ago in a car accident. I was driving." His voice shook slightly. "We'd had an argument. I was distracted, angry. I didn't see the truck coming. Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Alexander continued as if he hadn't heard her. "She was a ballerina, you know, one of the best in the New York company. She had a bright future ahead of her." He looked at Madison, his eyes filled with an ancient pain, and I took that away from her. At that moment, Madison understood. The guilt Alexander carried was not just for his wife's death, but for having robbed her of what she loved most, dancing. "It wasn't your fault," Madison said softly, surprised at her own boldness. "Accidents happen. I'm sure your wife wouldn't want you to live like this, blaming yourself." Alexander looked at her, a mixture of surprise and something else in his eyes. "You talk as if you understand." Madison hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was a dancer too," she admitted. "Or at least I was about to become one. I graduated from Juilliard 6 months ago." Alexander's eyes widened in understanding. "What happened?" "A knee injury during my graduation recital," Madison explained, feeling the familiar twinge of pain as she remembered. "The doctors said I'll never be able to dance professionally again." A silence fell between them, filled only by the soft hum of the greenhouse's irrigation systems. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice soft. "Is that why you dance on the beach at night?" Madison froze, shocked. Did you see me?" Alexander nodded slowly. "The night I came back, you were dancing in the moonlight. It was extraordinary." Madison's face burned with shame and something else she couldn't name. "I didn't know anyone was watching." "You dance as if your life depended on it," Alexander said softly. "Like Sophia used to dance." There was a vulnerability in his voice that made Madison's heart race. For a moment, they just looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, as if realizing how much he had revealed, Alexander stood up abruptly. "It's late. You should go to bed." Madison stood up too, sensing that the moment had passed. "Yes, sir. Good night." As she reached the greenhouse door, Alexander's voice stopped her. "Ms. Ramirez?" She turned to look at him. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening." Madison nodded, a small smile on her lips. "Good night, Mr. Ashworth." As she walked back to her quarters, Madison felt as if something fundamental had changed. The conversation in the greenhouse had created a connection between her and Alexander, a mutual understanding born of shared pain and a passion for dance. But with that connection came new complications. Madison knew she shouldn't, get emotionally involved with her employer, and yet she couldn't deny the attraction she felt, the way her heart raced when he was around. Over the next few days, Madison noticed a subtle change in Alexander's behavior. He was no longer cold and distant, but seemed to look for opportunities to talk to her, even briefly. His eyes followed her as she worked, and more than once she caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression. One afternoon, while Madison was tidying up the library, Alexander came in carrying a dusty box. "Miss Ramirez," he said, his voice soft, "I'd like to show you something." Curious, Madison approached. Alexander opened the box, revealing a collection of DVDs and theater programs. "These are Sophia's performances," he explained, his voice charged with emotion. "I haven't been able to look at them since, well, you know." Madison felt her heart squeeze. "Why are you showing me this, sir?" Alexander looked her in the eye, and there was an intensity in his gaze that left her breathless. "Because I think you would understand. The passion, the dedication she had for dance. It's the same one I saw in you that night on the beach." Without thinking, Madison reached out and touched Alexander's arm in a gesture of comfort. She felt his muscles tense under her touch, but he didn't pull away. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said softly. For a moment, they stood there, too close, the tension between them almost palpable. Then, as if waking from a trance, Alexander pulled back. "I should go," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have a meeting soon." Madison nodded, feeling strangely disappointed. "Of course, sir." As Alexander left the library, Madison found herself staring at Sophia's memory box. She knew she was entering dangerous territory. Alexander Ashworth was her boss, a man still clearly tormented by the past. And yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, the way her heart raced in his presence. That night, as she prepared for bed, Madison reflected on the events of the last few days. She had come to Newport in search of a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life after the loss of her dancing dreams. She had never imagined that she would meet someone who understood her passion and pain so deeply, but as she felt more and more drawn to Alexander, Madison couldn't help but wonder, was she really falling for him, or just the reflection of her own loss that she saw in him? And Alexander, did he see her as she really was, or just as a reminder of his lost wife? With these questions in mind, Madison fell asleep, dreaming of dances in the moonlight and dark eyes full of sadness and unspoken promises. The weeks passed, and life at Ashworth fell into a comfortable but tense routine. Madison found herself increasingly aware of Alexander's presence, her heart racing every time she saw him. In turn, Alexander seemed to gravitate towards her, finding excuses to be in the same rooms, starting casual conversations that invariably went deeper. One particularly hot summer afternoon, Madison was cleaning the huge windows in the music room when she heard the soft sound of a piano. Curious, she approached the ajar door and peeked inside. Alexander was sitting at the piano, his fingers gliding deftly over the keys. The melody was melancholy and beautiful, full of restrained emotion. Madison stood paralyzed, mesmerized by the sight of the usually so controlled man giving himself completely to the music. Without realizing it, she took a step into the room, and a floorboard creaked under her feet. Alexander stopped playing abruptly, turning to face her. "I'm sorry," Madison stammered, feeling her face burn. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Alexander watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Madison's surprise, a small smile curved his lips. "Don't worry," he said softly. "Actually, I'm glad you heard it. It was Sophia's composition." Madison felt her heart squeeze. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Alexander nodded, his eyes distant. "She used to dance to that song. It was magical." He looked at Madison, a vulnerability in his eyes that she rarely saw. Would you like to try?" Madison froze, shocked by the invitation. I don't know if I can," she whispered, feeling the familiar tightness of pain in her chest. "My knee." "Just a slow dance," Alexander insisted gently. "Nothing fancy, just feel the music." Hesitating, Madison took a step forward. Alexander began to play again, the soft melody filling the room. Slowly, almost against her will, Madison began to move. At first, her movements were timid, restrained, but as the music flowed around her, she felt herself relax. Her arms rose gracefully, her feet gliding across the polished floor. It wasn't the precise, technical dance she used to perform, but something more organic, more emotional. Alexander watched, fascinated, his fingers never leaving the keys. There was something about the way Madison moved that reminded him painfully of Sophia, and yet it was completely unique. She danced with raw vulnerability, each movement an expression of loss and hope. When the song finally came to an end, Madison stopped, panting. Tears were silently streaming down her face, but there was a smile on her lips. For a moment, silence reigned in the room, charged with unspoken emotion. Then Alexander got up from the piano and approached her. Without saying a word, he reached out and gently dried a tear from Madison's cheek. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion, "for bringing dancing back to this room." Madison looked at him, feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I've missed it," she admitted, "more than I realized." Alexander nodded, understanding. "Dancing, it never really leaves you, does it? Even when you think it does." At that moment, standing so close together, the tension between them was palpable. Madison could feel the heat of Alexander's body, see the raw emotion in his eyes. For a brief moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. But then, as if waking from a dream, Alexander pulled back. I should go," he said, his voice tense. "I have work to do." Madison nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and disappointment. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Thank you for the music." After Alexander left, Madison stood in the music room for a long time, her heart beating furiously. She knew she had crossed a line, that things between her and Alexander would never be the same again. In the days that followed, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere of the mansion. Alexander seemed to avoid her, keeping himself busy with meetings and phone calls. When they did meet, there was a tension in the air, an unspoken feeling that hung between them. Madison felt confused and hurt. She knew she shouldn't have allowed herself to become emotionally involved with her employer, but she couldn't deny the feelings that were growing in her heart. At the same time, she wondered if Alexander really saw her, or if she was just an echo of Sophia, a reminder of a past he couldn't leave behind. One night, unable to sleep, Madison decided to take a walk in the gardens. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, and the full moon bathed everything in silver light. As she walked, lost in thought, she heard voices coming from the terrace. "You're getting too involved, Alex," said a voice that Madison recognized as Marcus, Alexander's friend. "She's your maid, for God's sake." "You don't understand," Alexander replied, his voice laced with frustration. "Madison, she makes me feel alive again. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I can breathe." Madison froze, her heart racing. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't pull away. "And you think that's fair on her?" Marcus asked softly. "She's not Sophia, Alex. You can't use her to fill the void that Sophia left." There was a long silence, and then Alexander's voice, low and broken. "I know that. Believe me, I know. But I can't. I can't stay away from her." Madison stepped back, feeling as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus' words echoed in her mind. "She's not Sophia." Was that what she was to Alexander, a replacement for his dead wife? With tears in her eyes, Madison ran back to her quarters. She threw herself on the bed, sobbing silently. All the confusion and pain of the last few weeks came flooding back, and she felt more lost than ever. The next morning, Madison woke up determined. She couldn't go on like this, stuck in this emotional limbo. She needed to talk to Alexander, to clear things up once and for all. Gathering up all her courage, she knocked on Alexander's office door. "Come in," came the reply from inside. Madison entered, her heart beating furiously. Alexander was sitting behind his desk, looking tired and tense. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Ramirez," he said formally, "what can I do for you?" Madison took a deep breath. "Mr. Ashworth, I think we need to talk." Alexander watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think so." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the gardens. "I assume you overheard my conversation with Marcus last night." Madison felt her face burn. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quickly. "I was just walking and—" Alexander held up his hand, interrupting her. "Don't apologize. Maybe it's better this way. Everything out in the open." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with an emotion that Madison couldn't decipher. "Madison," he said softly, and the use of her first name made her shudder. I don't know how to deal with what I'm feeling." Madison felt her heart racing. "And what are you feeling?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Alexander took a step towards her. "When I'm with you, I feel alive again. You make me want to smile, want to live." "But—" he hesitated, the pain evident in his eyes. "But I don't know if what I feel is real, or if it's just a shadow from the past." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm not Sophia," she said softly. "I know," Alexander replied, his voice breaking. "Believe me, I know that. You're unique, Madison. You're extraordinary in your own right." He reached out, almost touching her face, but stopped at the last moment. "But I don't know if I should." Madison closed her eyes, feeling a tear run down her cheek. "I understand," she whispered. "I really do, Mr. Ashworth." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Madison opened her eyes and looked directly at Alexander. I think it would be better if I resigned." Alexander looked shocked. What? No, Madison, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted him gently. We both need space to think, to heal. I came to Newport for a fresh start, and I think it's time to really embrace that. Alexander watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, of course. You've always been wiser than me about these things. He gave a sad little smile. I'll make sure you get an excellent letter of recommendation and a generous severance package. Madison nodded, feeling her heart break a little more. Thank you, Mr. Ashworth, for everything. She turned to leave, but Alexander's voice stopped her. Madison! She looked back. Alexander was standing there, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. I'm sorry, for not being strong enough, for not being the man you deserve. Madison felt more tears run down her face. Don't apologize, she said softly. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the timing just isn't right. With one last look, Madison left the office, closing the door softly behind her. As she walked down the corridor, she felt as if she was leaving a part of herself behind. But as she went on, Madison also felt a strange sense of freedom. She had come to Newport in search of a fresh start, and although it wasn't in the way she had expected, that was exactly what she was getting. As she packed her things, Madison thought back to the dance she had shared with Alexander in the music room. That moment of pure connection, of raw emotion, she knew she would carry that memory with her forever. And who knows, maybe one day, when the wounds had healed and time had done its work, their paths would cross again. But for now, it was time to move on, to dance to the beat of their own music. With a suitcase in hand and a heavy but determined heart, Madison Ramirez left the Ashworth mansion, ready to write the next chapter of her life. The cab snaked through the streets of Providence and Rhode Island as Madison watched the cityscape from the window. It had been 3 months since she had left the Ashworth mansion, and every day since had been a journey of self-discovery and reinvention. With Alexander's generous severance pay, Madison had allowed herself a period of reflection. She rented a small apartment in downtown Providence, a vibrant city full of artistic life. It was a fresh start, just what she needed. When the cab pulled up in front of an old red brick building, Madison felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She paid the driver, grabbed her purse and got out of the car, glancing at the sign above the door, Providence Performing Arts Center. Taking a deep breath, she entered the building. The interior was a striking contrast to the historic exterior, modern, well-lit spaces full of mirrors and ballet bars. The sound of music and excited voices echoed through the corridors. Madison, you've arrived, an excited voice called out. Madison turned and saw Sarah, the center's director, coming towards her with a big smile. Hello, Sarah, Madison replied, returning the smile. I'm a bit nervous, to be honest. Sarah put a comforting hand on Madison's shoulder. You don't have to be. The children will love you. Come on, let me show you the studio. As she followed Sarah through the corridors, Madison reflected on how she had arrived there. In the first few weeks after leaving Newport, she had felt lost, her heart still aching from her separation from Alexander. But then, one rainy afternoon, she had stumbled upon this arts center. Sarah, a former dancer who had founded the center to bring performing arts to underprivileged children, was fascinated by Madison's story. She offered Madison a position as a dance instructor for children, arguing that her experience with injuries made her perfectly suited to teaching dance in a safe and inclusive way. Initially hesitant, Madison eventually accepted the offer. The idea of passing on her love of dance to the next generation, especially to children who would otherwise not have access to dance classes, touched something deep inside her. Here we are, said Sarah, opening the door to a spacious studio. Your first class starts in 15 minutes. These are children aged 8 to 12, mostly beginners. Madison nodded, feeling a wave of nervousness and excitement. Thank you, Sarah, for this opportunity, for everything. Sarah smiled gently. You deserve it, Madison. Now get out there and show these children the magic of dance. As the children began to enter the studio, Madison felt her nervousness dissipate. There was something about their energy and enthusiasm that was contagious. She began the class with simple stretching exercises, watching each child carefully, offering gentle guidance when necessary. As the class progressed, Madison was surprised by how natural it all seemed. She could see the sparkle in the children's eyes when they managed to master a new movement, the pure joy on their faces as they danced freely to the music. At the end of the class, as the children left excitedly discussing what they had learned, Madison felt fulfilled in a way she hadn't experienced for a long time. She realized that although her dream of being a professional dancer had ended, a new dream was being born. In the months that followed, Madison threw herself headlong into her new role. She developed a special program for children with physical limitations, using her own experience with injuries to create adapted dance routines. Her classes soon became the most popular at the center, with a waiting list. One afternoon, after a particularly rewarding class, Madison was tidying up the studio when Sarah walked in, holding an envelope. "Madison, this came for you," said Sarah, handing over the envelope. Madison looked at the sender and felt her heart leap. It was from Newport, Rhode Island. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Madison, I hope this letter finds you well. I've spent months debating whether to write, fearing that my intrusion might disrupt the new life you've surely built for yourself. But there are things that need to be said, truths that deserve to come to light. Since you left, the mansion seems empty, devoid of the life and light you brought. I realize now how much your presence meant, not just to me, but to everyone here. In the months since you left, I've done a lot of soul-searching. I've started therapy, something I should have done a long time ago. I'm learning to deal with my grief, to accept that the loss of Sophia doesn't mean the end of my own life. Most importantly, I'm learning to see you, Madison, for the extraordinary human being that you are, not as a shadow of the past or an echo of lost memories. I'm not asking anything of you. I know I don't have that right. I just wanted you to know that you have made a profound difference to my life. You showed me that it's possible to feel joy again, that it's possible to dance even when your heart is heavy. I hope you found the peace and happiness you deserve. If our paths ever cross again, I hope we can meet as two whole people, healed and ready for a new beginning. With gratitude and best wishes, Alexander Ashworth Madison finished reading the letter, silent tears streaming down her face. Sarah, who had remained silent, asked softly, "Are you all right?" Madison nodded, carefully folding the letter. "Yes, I am. It's just closure, I guess." That night, in her apartment, Madison reread the letter several times. Each word seemed to resonate inside her, bringing out emotions she had carefully stored away. Sitting down at her small desk, she picked up a pen and paper. There was so much she wanted to tell Alexander, so much she wanted to share about her new life, her discoveries, her hopes for the future. But as the words flowed, Madison realized that she wasn't just writing to Alexander, she was writing to herself, articulating for the first time all the thoughts and feelings that had accumulated over the last few months. Dear Alexander, your letter touched me deeply. Knowing that our brief connection has had such a significant impact on your life fills me with bittersweet joy. I am happy to hear that you are seeking help and working to heal your wounds. Grief is a long and difficult journey, but I truly believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. As for me, I've found a new purpose here in Providence. I'm teaching dance to children at a community arts center. It's work that challenges and fulfills me in ways I never imagined possible. Through these children, I'm rediscovering my love of dance. It's not the career I dreamed of, but there's a unique beauty in passing on my passion to the next generation. Our story, Alexander, however brief, has taught me a lot about myself. I've learned that I'm stronger than I imagined, that I can reinvent myself even in the face of adversity. Like you, I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that I have precious memories of our time together. The dance we shared in the music room will always remain with me, a reminder of the deep connection two souls can form through art. Perhaps one day, when the stars align, our paths will cross again. Until then, I wish you all the happiness and peace you deserve. Keep dancing, Alexander. even if it's only in your heart. With affection. Madison reread her letter, a soft smile on her lips. She knew she would send this letter, not with any expectations or hopes of a future together, but as a recognition of the impact they had had on each other's lives. In the days that followed, Madison felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The exchange of letters with Alexander had brought a sense of closure, allowing her to fully embrace her present and look forward to the future with hope. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Madison decided to do something she hadn't done for a long time. She went down to the beach, took off her shoes and started dancing in the sand. Her movements were different now, no longer the perfect technique of a professional dancer, but something freer, more authentic. She danced with the joy of someone who had found her way back to herself. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Madison stopped, panting and smiling. She looked out at the vast ocean in front of her and felt a wave of gratitude for everything she had experienced. Her journey had been difficult, full of loss and challenges, but through it all, she had discovered a fundamental truth. Dance, in all its forms, was more than a career. It was an expression of life, of emotion, of human connection, and as the last ray of sunshine disappeared over the horizon, Madison made a silent promise to herself. She would keep dancing, keep growing, keep embracing each new chapter of her life with courage and grace, because in the end, life itself was a dance, full of unexpected turns, occasional falls, but also moments of breathtaking beauty, and Madison was determined to dance every step with everything she had. Autumn arrived in Providence with an explosion of vibrant colors and fresh air that energized the city. For Madison, the last few months had been a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. Her letter to Alexander remained unanswered, but she wasn't fazed by it. After all, she had written with no expectations, just the desire to share her journey. On a particularly busy Saturday morning, Madison was running around the Performing Arts Center, helping with preparations for the annual fundraising event. The space was an organized chaos of decorations, volunteers, and excited children rehearsing their performances. "Madison," Sarah called out, waving frantically from across the main hall. "We need you in the meeting room, now." Intrigued and a little worried, Madison made her way through the crowd. As she entered the meeting room, she was greeted by a sight that left her momentarily breathless. Alexander Ashworth was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, gazing thoughtfully at the commotion outside. At the sound of the door closing, he turned, his eyes meeting Madison's. "Hello, Madison," he said softly, a small smile playing on his lips. Madison felt her heart racing. "Alexander," she replied, surprise evident in her voice. I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah, who was standing next to the meeting table, intervened enthusiastically. "Mr. Ashworth contacted us a few weeks ago. He's interested in making a substantial donation to the center." Madison blinked, trying to process the information. That's wonderful," she managed to say, even though her mind was spinning. Alexander stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Madison's. "I was hoping I could talk to you in private, if it's not too much trouble." Sarah, sensing the tension in the air, quickly excused herself and left the room, leaving Madison and Alexander alone. For a moment, silence reigned between them, laden with unspoken words and restrained emotions. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Your letter. It meant a lot to me, Madison. It made me realize some important things." Madison nodded slowly, feeling suddenly vulnerable. "I'm glad it reached you. I wasn't sure." "I should have answered," Alexander interrupted her gently. "But the truth is, I didn't know what to say, or rather, I knew what I wanted to say, but I wasn't sure I had the right to say it." He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that Madison recognized as a sign of nervousness. "Over the last few months, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about finding a new purpose, and I realized that I wanted to do something meaningful, something that could make a difference in people's lives." Madison felt a smile forming on her lips. "And you thought about supporting the arts for underprivileged children?" Alexander nodded, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Yes, but that's not all. Madison, what you're doing here, it's incredible. You're changing lives through dance, just like Sophia used to dream of doing. Hearing Sophia's name, Madison felt a pang in her heart. But there was something different about the way Alexander spoke of her now, no longer with raw pain, but with a kind of serene acceptance. Alexander, Madison began hesitantly, I'm glad you want to support the center, but why are you really here? He looked her straight in the eye, all pretense disappearing from his posture. Because I missed you, Madison. Because over the last few months, I realized that I had let fear and guilt stop me from embracing something wonderful that was right in front of me. Madison felt her heart racing. And what did you realize? That I'm in love with you, Alexander said simply. Not as an echo of the past, not as a replacement for Sophia, but for who you are. Your strength, your passion, your ability to reinvent yourself and find beauty even in the most difficult circumstances. I fell in love with all of that. Alexander's words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Madison felt tears forming in her eyes, a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Alexander, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I don't know what to say. I've missed you too. But so much has changed. I've changed. He took a step towards her, careful not to invade her personal space. I know, and it's this Madison who's in front of me now that I want to get to know better, if you give me the chance. Before Madison could reply, the door opened abruptly and Sarah entered, looking apologetic but urgent. Sorry to interrupt, but Madison, we need you on stage. The dress rehearsal is about to start and the children are asking for you. Madison nodded, grateful for the interruption that gave her a moment to breathe and process everything that had happened. Sure, I'll be there in a minute. Turning to Alexander, she said, Can we continue this conversation later? Alexander smiled gently. Of course. Actually, I'd love to see the rehearsal if that's not a problem. With a nod of agreement from Sarah, the three of them left the meeting room and headed for the main auditorium. As they walked, Madison felt hyper-aware of Alexander's presence beside her, a mixture of nervousness and excitement bubbling up in her stomach. The auditorium was full of energy, with children of all ages preparing for their performances. When Madison took to the stage, she was greeted by a wave of smiles and enthusiastic nods. Well done, everyone, she said, her clear, confident voice echoing through the space. Let's show everyone how hard you've worked. Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about expressing who you are through dance. Are you ready? A chorus of yes echoed through the auditorium, and Madison couldn't help but smile. She cast a quick glance at the audience, finding Alexander sitting in the front row, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she wasn't yet ready to name. As the rehearsal progressed, Madison lost herself in the music and movements, gently guiding the children and offering words of encouragement. She barely noticed when, during a pause between performances, Alexander discreetly came on stage and approached her. This is incredible, Madison, he said softly, his eyes shining with admiration. You're incredible. Before she could reply, one of the younger girls, Lily, ran up to them, her eyes wide with excitement. Miss Madison, she exclaimed. Who's that? Is he your boyfriend? Madison felt her face burn, but before she could answer, Alexander bent down to be at Lily's eye level. Hello, he said gently. I'm Alexander, a friend of Miss Madison's. And you must be one of the talented dancers she's always praising. Lily nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Miss Madison taught me how to pirouette. Want to see? Without waiting for an answer, Lily began to spin, a little clumsily, but with a pure joy that was contagious. Alexander laughed, applauding when she finished with an exaggerated bow. Bravo, he exclaimed. That was wonderful. Madison watched the interaction with a smile, feeling something warm and comforting spread through her chest. Seeing Alexander interacting so naturally with one of his students, seeing him genuinely enchanted by the simple joy of dance, made something change inside her. As the rehearsal continued, Madison found herself casting furtive glances at Alexander. He remained in the audience, watching each performance intently, applauding enthusiastically and occasionally exchanging smiles with Madison. When the rehearsal finally ended, the children left the stage in a flurry of laughter and excited chatter. Madison came down from the stage, feeling exhausted but fulfilled. Alexander met her at the foot of the stairs, a gentle smile on his face. "That was truly inspiring, Madison. What you're doing here is extraordinary." Madison felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you, that means a lot to me." They stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence settling between them. Finally, Alexander spoke. "I know we have a lot to talk about, a lot to sort out, but after seeing you today, after seeing the life and joy you bring to these children, Madison, I'm sure how I feel about you, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes, to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of a chance." Madison felt her heart racing. She knew there was still a lot to consider, a lot to discuss, but at that moment, looking into Alexander's eyes, seeing the sincerity and vulnerability in his gaze, she felt something change inside her. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we could start with a coffee. After the fundraising event tomorrow." The smile that lit up Alexander's face was like the sunrise. "I'd love that." As they said goodbye, promising to meet the next day, Madison felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She didn't know exactly where this new step would take them, but for the first time in a long time, she was eager to find out. That night, lying in her bed, Madison reflected on the day's events. Life had a funny way of surprising her, of bringing people back when they were least expected. But perhaps, she thought, sometimes you had to take a few steps back before you could move forward. With a smile on her lips, Madison fell asleep, dreaming of new dance moves and unexplored possibilities. The day of the fundraising event dawned bright and promising. Madison woke up early, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation churning in her stomach. It wasn't just the event that made her nervous, but also the promised meeting with Alexander afterwards. Arriving at the Performing Arts Center, Madison immersed herself in the hustle and bustle of the final preparations. The main hall had been transformed into an elegant space, with colorful ribbons hanging from the ceiling and children's artwork adorning the walls. "Madison!" Sarah called out, waving from near the stage. "Can you help me with the final sound checks?" As she worked, Madison couldn't help but notice the growing crowd of guests arriving. Parents, potential sponsors, and community members filled the space, creating a buzz of anticipation. It was then that she saw him. Alexander entered the hall, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that accentuated his eyes. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowd until his eyes met hers. A soft smile spread across his face, and Madison felt her heart leap. Before she could react, however, she was engulfed by a group of eager children, all talking at once about their costumes and the anticipation of the performance. "Miss Madison, I'm nervous," exclaimed Lily, the girl who had pirouetted for Alexander the day before. Madison bent down to be at the girl's eye level. "Remember what we practiced, Lily. Take a deep breath and let the music guide you. You'll do wonderfully." With words of encouragement and quick hugs, Madison sent the children backstage, feeling a wave of pride and affection for her little dancers. The event began with a moving speech by Sarah about the importance of the arts in children's lives, followed by a series of performances that left the audience spellbound. Madison watched from backstage, her heart filling with joy with every radiant smile and graceful movement of her students. During a brief break between performances, Alexander managed to approach her. "They're amazing," he said softly, his eyes shining with admiration. "You've done a wonderful job with them, Madison." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you. They worked very hard for it." For a moment they stood there, a comfortable silence settling between them. Then Alexander spoke again. "Is our coffee still standing after that?" Madison nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, I'd love to." The rest of the event passed in a blur of applause, tears of joy and emotional hugs. When it was finally over, Madison found herself exhausted but deeply satisfied. "Do you mind if we walk?" asked Alexander when they finally made it outside. "I know a lovely cafe a few blocks from here," Madison agreed, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs and breathe in the fresh autumn air. They walked side by side, a comfortable silence between them, occasionally broken by comments about the event or observations about the city around them. The cafe was a cozy place, with exposed brick walls and the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee. They sat at a corner table, away from the bustle of the entrance. "So," Alexander began, after they had placed their orders, "how are you feeling? It must have been an intense day." Madison smiled, feeling relaxed for the first time in hours. Exhausted but happy, seeing those children on stage, seeing how much they've grown. "It's indescribable." Alexander nodded, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blush. "You've found your calling, Madison. It's beautiful to see." There was a pause, laden with unspoken words. Finally, Madison gathered the courage to approach the elephant in the room. "Alexander," she began hesitantly, "about yesterday. About what you said." He reached out, almost touching hers on the table, but stopping at the last moment. "I meant every word, Madison, but I also understand if it's too much, if it's too soon." Madison felt her heart racing. "It's not that it's too much," she said softly. "It's just that so much has changed. We've both changed. And there are so many things we need to discuss, so many unresolved issues." Alexander nodded, his face serious. "You're right. And I'm willing to discuss everything, to be completely honest about where I am and how I feel. But first, there's something I need to tell you." He paused, taking a deep breath as if preparing himself for something difficult. "After you left, I went into a downward spiral. I drank too much, neglected business. It was Marcus who finally made me see that I needed help." Madison listened intently, her heart squeezing at the pain evident in Alexander's voice. "I started therapy," he continued, "and it was during those sessions that I realized how much I had been holding on to the guilt over Sophia's death, how I had been using that guilt as an excuse not to live, not to allow myself to feel anything new." He looked directly into Madison's eyes, his voice trembling slightly. "It was then that I realized how much you meant to me, and how I had let fear stop me from embracing something wonderful." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. "Oh, Alexander, I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me," he said quickly. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that I'm committed to being better, to dealing with my problems in a healthy way, and because I want you to understand why it took me so long to come after you." Madison reached out, gently touching Alexander's hand. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It means a lot." They were silent for a moment, Alexander's words hanging between them. Finally, Madison spoke. "I, too, have gone through many changes. I've found a new purpose, a new version of myself. And part of me is afraid that if we get involved again, I might lose that." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "I understand that fear. And I want you to know that the last thing I want is for you to lose your identity or your purpose. In fact, seeing you flourish, seeing the difference you're making in these children's lives, that just makes me admire you even more." Madison felt a warmth spread through her chest. "So, what do we do now?" Alexander smiled softly. "How about we start slowly? We can meet for coffees, lunches, get to know each other again. No pressure, no expectations. Just two adults exploring the possibility of something more." Madison considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories from the last few months, laughing at shared memories and discovering new things about each other. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Can I walk you home?" Alexander asked. Madison nodded, smiling. They walked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing against each other, sending goosebumps down their arms. When they reached Madison's apartment, they stopped, a moment's hesitation hanging between them. "Thanks for the coffee," Madison said softly. "And for the talk. It was enlightening." Alexander smiled, his eyes sparkling in the twilight. "It was my pleasure, Madison. I hope we can do this again soon." For a moment they stood there, looking at each other. Then, slowly, Alexander leaned down and placed a soft kiss on Madison's cheek. "Good night," he whispered. "Good night," she replied, feeling her heart race. As she watched Alexander walk away, Madison felt a mixture of emotions swirl inside her. There was hope, excitement, but also a hint of apprehension. They had a long road ahead of them, many things to sort out and discuss, but for the first time in a long time, Madison allowed herself to dream of the possibility of a future with Alexander, a future where they could both heal completely, where they could grow together without losing their individual identities. Entering her apartment, Madison made her way to the window, watching the lights of the city she now called home. She thought of the children at the arts center, of Alexander, of the whole journey that had brought her here. With a smile, she made a silent promise to herself. Whatever the future held, she would keep dancing, keep growing, keep embracing each new step with courage and grace. Because in the end, life was a dance, and Madison was determined to make the most of it, one step at a time. The weeks following the fundraiser were a whirlwind of emotions for Madison. She and Alexander kept their promise to take things slowly, meeting for occasional coffees and long lunches. Each encounter brought new revelations, shared laughter, and a deeper understanding of each other. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Madison was in the local park, supervising a picnic organized for the children of the Arts Center. The air was filled with laughter, and the sound of soft music coming from a small portable speaker. "Miss Madison, look what I can do," shouted Lily, performing a series of graceful spins on the grass. Madison applauded, her heart filling with pride. "Incredible, Lily. You've practiced a lot, haven't you?" As she watched the children playing and dancing freely, Madison felt a familiar presence beside her. Turning around, she saw Alexander, a warm smile on his face. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said softly. Madison shook her head, returning the smile. "Not at all. In fact, I'm glad you're here." Alexander looked around, observing the children with genuine interest. "They look so happy and free. It's inspiring to see." Before Madison could reply, Lily ran up to them, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mr. Alexander, have you come to dance with us?" Alexander laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made Madison's heart leap. "Oh, I don't know if I'm a good dancer, Lily." "Miss Madison can teach you," Lily insisted, tugging on Alexander's hand. "She's the best teacher in the world." Madison felt her face heat up at the compliment. "Well, what do you say, Mr. Ashworth? Are you up for an impromptu dance lesson?" Alexander's eyes met hers, full of amusement and something deeper. How can I refuse such a charming invitation? With Lily leading the way, the three of them joined the group of dancing children. Madison began to demonstrate simple moves, her voice soft but clear above the music. "The secret is to feel the music, to let it guide your movements," she explained, moving gracefully. Alexander watched intently, then began to imitate Madison's movements, a little clumsily at first, but quickly improving. "Like this?" he asked, executing a rather unstable spin. Madison laughed, a light, musical sound. "Almost there. Here, let me show you." Without thinking, she moved closer, placing one hand gently on Alexander's arm and the other on his waist. "It's more on the hip, see?" The touch sent shivers through them both, and for a moment they stood there, too close, the world around them disappearing. Alexander's eyes locked onto Madison's, filled with an intensity that left her breathless. The moment was broken by Lily, who spun between them, laughing merrily. "You two dance so well together." Madison pulled away, feeling her face burn. "Thank you, Lily. Why don't you show Mr. Alexander that sequence we were practicing?" As Lily excitedly began to demonstrate a series of steps, Madison took the opportunity to pull herself together. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Alexander, the way her heart raced when he was around, but she also knew that they needed to keep going slowly, building a solid foundation for anything that might develop between them. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of dancing, games, and laughter. When it was finally time to take the children back to the center, Madison found herself reluctant to see the day end. "That was unexpectedly wonderful," Alexander commented as he helped to collect the scattered blankets and toys. Madison smiled, feeling a wave of affection for him. "Thank you for joining us. The children loved having you here." "And you?" Alexander asked softly. "Did you enjoy having me here?" Madison looked him in the eye, feeling her heart race. "Yes," she admitted. "I really enjoyed it." Alexander's smile lit up his whole face. "That's good. Because I was thinking, there's a dance festival happening in town next week. Maybe we could go together, like an official date." Madison felt a surge of excitement and nervousness. It was a step forward in their developing relationship, a clearer statement of intent. "I'd love to," she replied, a soft smile on her lips. In the days leading up to the festival, Madison found herself torn between the excitement of meeting Alexander and a new challenge that had arisen at the Arts Center. Sarah had come to her with an exciting but daunting proposal. "Madison," Sarah said, her eyes shining with excitement, "the Providence Dance Company has contacted us. They're interested in partnering with the Center for a mentoring program, and they want you to be the coordinator." Madison was stunned, a mixture of emotions flooding her. "Me? But why?" Sarah smiled gently. "Because you're amazing, Madison. The work you've been doing here, especially with children with physical limitations, has caught their attention. This is an opportunity to expand our reach, to make an even bigger difference." Madison felt her heart race. It was an incredible opportunity, a chance to unite her past as a professional dancer with her present as a teacher. But it also meant more responsibilities, more pressure. "Can I think about it?" she asked hesitantly. Sarah nodded understandingly. "Of course, take your time." On the night of the dance festival, Madison was still pondering the proposal. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that flowed gracefully when she moved. Alexander met her at the entrance to the festival site, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "You look stunning," he said softly, offering her his arm. Madison smiled, taking his arm. "You don't look bad yourself." The festival was a spectacle of color, music, and movement. They wandered around the different stages, watching performances ranging from classical ballet to contemporary street dance. During a break between performances, they found a quiet bench away from the crowd. Alexander noticed Madison's pensive expression. "Is something worrying you?" he asked gently. Madison hesitated for a moment, then decided to share. She told Alexander about the dance company's proposal, expressing both her enthusiasm and her doubts. Alexander listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. When she had finished, he took her hand gently. "Madison," he said, his voice full of affection, "you are one of the most talented and compassionate people I have ever met. You have a gift not only for dance, but for inspiring and uplifting others. This opportunity seems perfect for you." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I let everyone down?" Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "You won't. I've seen what you do with those children, how you inspire them to believe in themselves. This mentoring program is just an extension of that." He paused, his eyes softening. "Besides, you won't be alone. I'll be here to support you every step of the way if you let me." Madison felt her heart expand with affection and gratitude. "Alexander, thank you. That means a lot to me." At that moment, sitting there with Alexander, the music of the festival floating around them, Madison felt a wave of clarity hit her. She was ready for this new challenge, ready to embrace this new phase of her life more fully. And maybe, just maybe, she was also ready to open her heart completely to the man next to her. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander leaned in slowly. This time, there was no hesitation as his lips met hers in a soft, tender kiss. When they parted, both smiling, Madison knew she had made her decision. She would accept the position of coordinator of the mentoring program, embracing the challenge and the opportunity for growth that it offered. And she would do it with Alexander by her side, both of them dancing together in this new phase of their lives, one step at a time. As they walked back to the festival, hand in hand, Madison felt filled with hope and possibilities. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was eager to see what it held. Because now she knew that, no matter what happened, She would have the strength to face any challenge, and she would have someone with whom to share every victory, every stumble and every dance along the way. The year that followed the night of the dance festival was a roller coaster of emotions and challenges for Madison and Alexander. The mentoring program with the Providence Dance Company took off, bringing new responsibilities and opportunities for Madison. Alexander, meanwhile, continued his personal healing work while tirelessly supporting Madison's endeavors. It was a spring afternoon when Madison found herself standing on the stage of the Municipal Theatre, nervously watching the audience that was forming. Tonight marked the culmination of months of hard work, the first joint performance between the students of the Arts Center and the professional dancers of the dance company. "Take a deep breath," a soft voice said behind her. Madison turned to look at Alexander, a reassuring smile on her face. "You've done an amazing job. They're ready." Madison nodded, feeling calmed by his presence. "Thank you for being here. I don't know if I could have done this without you." Alexander took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You could. You're stronger than you think. But I'm happy to be by your side." Backstage, the energy was palpable. Children in colorful tutus mingled with professional dancers in elaborate costumes. Madison went from group to group, offering words of encouragement and last-minute adjustments. "Miss Madison," Lily, now 10, ran up to her, her eyes shining with excitement. "I'm a bit nervous." Madison bent down to be at the girl's eye level. "It's normal to be nervous, Lily. Do you know what I do when I'm nervous? I close my eyes and imagine I'm dancing just for myself, like we used to do in the park. Can you try that?" Lily nodded, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was a new gleam of determination in them. "Thank you, Miss Madison. I think I'm ready now." With one last hug for Lily, Madison headed backstage. The performance was about to begin. The curtains opened for the first scene, a carefully choreographed mix of professional dancers and children from the center. Soft music filled the theater, and Madison felt her heart expand as she watched her students move gracefully across the stage, their faces beaming with joy. Scene after scene, the performance unfolded like a dream. There were moments of pure technical beauty from the professional dancers, interspersed with touching scenes from the children, each shining in their own unique way. The highlight of the evening was a duet between Lily and one of the company's principal dancers. The choreography, created by Madison, highlighted Lily's skills while allowing the professional dancer to guide and support her. It was a dancing metaphor for the mentoring program itself. When the curtains finally closed for the final number, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a deafening explosion of applause. Madison felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her students and the professional dancers embracing and celebrating. Suddenly, she found herself being pushed onto the stage by Sarah and some of the dancers. "They want to see you," Sarah insisted with a big smile. Blinking under the bright lights, Madison found herself in front of a standing audience, applauding enthusiastically. She bowed, her heart overflowing with emotion. When she finally made it off the stage, she was immediately enveloped in a warm hug from Alexander. "You were amazing," he whispered in her ear. "I'm so proud of you." Madison pulled away slightly, looking into Alexander's eyes. At that moment, seeing the love and admiration in his gaze, she knew she was ready to take the next step. "Alexander," she began, her voice quivering with emotion, "this past year has been an incredible journey, and having you by my side, well, it's meant everything to me." Alexander smiled softly, taking her hands in his. "For me too, Madison. You brought light back into my life in a way I never thought possible again." Madison took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love you, Alexander, and I'm ready. I'm ready for us to build a life together, if that's what you want too." Alexander's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with deep emotion. "Oh, Madison," he said, his voice hoarse, "I love you so much. And there's nothing I want more than to build a life with you." He paused, a playful smile appearing on his lips. "Actually, I had planned something a little more elaborate for this moment, but since we're here..." To Madison's surprise, Alexander knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Madison Ramirez," he said, his voice full of emotion, "would you do me the honor of marrying me, to dance together for the rest of our lives?" Madison felt her heart stop for a moment, then explode with joy. "Yes!" she exclaimed, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Yes, yes! 1,000 times yes!" Alexander slid the ring onto her finger. A delicate gold hoop with a small solitaire diamond. It was simple and elegant, perfectly Madison. They kissed, oblivious to the applause and shouts of joy that erupted around them. When they finally parted, they were immediately engulfed in hugs and congratulations from Sarah, the children and the dancers. Hours later, when the excitement had finally died down, Madison and Alexander were walking hand in hand through the park where they had danced together for the first time. "So," Alexander said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes, "what do you think of a celebratory dance?" Madison laughed, feeling light and happy. "Here, now. We don't have any music?" Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "Who needs music when we have the rhythm of our hearts?" And there, under the starry sky, they danced. It wasn't a perfect or technically impressive dance. It was a dance of joy, of love, of promises for the future. As they spun and moved together, Madison reflected on the journey that had brought her there. From the pain of losing her dream of dancing professionally, to the joy of finding a new purpose in teaching, from loneliness in Newport to building a community in Providence, and, of course, from meeting Alexander unexpectedly to building a deep and lasting love. She thought of Sophia, Alexander's late wife, and felt a wave of gratitude. Gratitude for the life Sophia had lived, for the way her legacy had, in a way, brought Madison and Alexander together. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked softly. Noticing Madison's distant gaze, she smiled, resting her head on his shoulder as they continued to move slowly. "I'm thinking about how unpredictable life is, how sometimes we need to lose something precious to find something just as valuable, only in a different way." Alexander nodded, understanding. "Life is a dance, isn't it? Full of unexpected turns and new steps to learn." "Yes," Madison agreed, "and I'm so happy to have you as my partner in this dance." They continued dancing, lost in their own world of love and possibilities, and as the night wore on, Madison knew that no matter what the future held, she and Alexander would face it together. They would dance through the ups and downs, the joys and sorrows, always in sync, always supporting each other. Because in the end, that was love. A continuous dance, a partnership of trust and mutual support. And Madison couldn't wait to see what new steps she and Alexander would learn together in the years to come. As the stars shone above, silent witnesses to their love, Madison and Alexander sealed their promise with a kiss that spoke of a past overcome, a present full of joy and a bright future of endless possibilities. And so, in a quiet park in Providence, a new dance began. The dance of two lives intertwined, moving together in perfect harmony, the dance of Madison and Alexander, the dance of love.